On a freezing night in Maple Ridge, a lonely man heard a faint scratching at his door. When he opened it, he found a golden retriever, frozen and desperate, clinging to life. But that was only the beginning. This heartwarming journey of love, hope, and second chances will melt your heart. If you believe every soul deserves a chance at love, comment yes and help spread the kindness. Maple Ridge, a small, time-worn town tucked against the northern slopes of Vermont, lay buried under the rage of an unforgiving winter. Snow hammered rooftops, devoured streets, and piled mercilessly against the wooden cabins that dotted the pine-swathed hills. The sky was a thick slab of bruised gray, sagging low over the earth, and the wind howled like a grieving spirit through the narrow alleys and empty fields. In the heart of this storm stood a battered log cabin on the edge of the forest, its roof sagging under the weight of accumulated snow, its single chimney coughing out thin tendrils of smoke that dissolved instantly into the whiteout. Inside, Daniel Brooks, a 47-year-old man with broad shoulders and the slouched posture of someone used to carrying invisible burdens, settled into the cracked leather armchair by the hearth. His brown hair was peppered with early gray, his face weathered and unshaven, his deep-set blue eyes dulled by years of solitude and quiet ache. Daniel had once been a lively man, the kind to fill a room with laughter, but life, particularly the life that had taken his wife, Maria, and his daughter, Emily, in a single cruel accident 5 years ago, had carved that man out of him, leaving behind a quieter, sadder frame. The house creaked as the storm pounded against it. Daniel tightened the wool blanket around his shoulders, sipping lukewarm coffee, staring blankly at the battered oak table he had spent the afternoon sanding. He had been fixing the place up, patching holes, reinforcing beams, mending whatever years of neglect and heartbreak had rotted through. He planned to sell it, finally leave Maple Ridge and its endless echoes behind, start somewhere fresh where the memories couldn't follow so easily. The fire crackled wearily in the hearth. Outside, the blizzard clawed at the world. Daniel opened a battered book of poetry, thumbing through pages he had read 1,000 times before, though the words rarely stayed long in his mind these days. That was when he heard it, a faint, desperate scratching at the door. At first, he thought it was the wind, or maybe the branches of the skeletal maple tree near the porch scraping against the siding. But then it came again. Scratch, scratch, a low, pitiful whimper almost swallowed by the storm. Daniel stiffened. Instinct told him to ignore it. Wild animals sometimes roamed near the cabins during storms, and getting involved usually meant trouble. Yet some old stubborn reflex that hadn't yet frozen over with the rest of him, pushed him to his feet. He shuffled across the creaky floor, the cold of the wood biting through his thick socks, and cautiously approached the door. As he reached for the handle, the scratching stopped. Silence thickened in the room, save for the rattling of the storm. Daniel cracked the door open, and the wind slapped him full in the face, carrying with it a flurry of needle-sharp snowflakes. He raised his arm against the blast, squinting into the night. There, huddled against the porch railing, was a golden retriever, barely more than a heap of trembling fur, its coat matted with ice and snow, ribs stark under its thin body. The dog tried to lift its head, but only managed a feeble whimper before collapsing into the drift. For a moment, Daniel stood frozen, heart thudding painfully against his ribs. He hadn't touched another living soul in months. He could close the door and pretend he hadn't seen. It would be the easier thing, the safer thing, but Maria's voice, light and fierce in his memory, cut through the haze of fear. "Kindness is the only thing that ever really matters, Danny." Without another thought, Daniel lunged forward, scooping the dog into his arms. The golden retriever was alarmingly light, its fur cold and brittle under his hands. "Hang on, buddy," Daniel muttered, kicking the door shut behind him with his boot. He laid the dog gently on the frayed rug before the fire, the heat barely reaching the animal's frozen frame. Quickly, Daniel stripped off his own jacket, draping it over the shivering body, then dashed into the kitchen, grabbing towels, a pot of lukewarm water, anything that might help. Kneeling beside the dog, he began rubbing vigorously, trying to melt the crusted ice from the creature's golden fur. The dog's appearance was pitiful. Once a majestic animal, now reduced to a hollow ghost of itself. His muzzle was dusted with gray, suggesting he was no longer young, maybe 8 or 9 years old. His eyes, when they flickered open for a breathless moment, were a soft, cloudy brown, filled with a weariness that mirrored Daniel's own. The golden retriever made a weak noise, not quite a whine, more a sigh of surrender. "You're all right," Daniel whispered hoarsely, his hands never stopping their work. "You're safe now." Outside, the storm raged on, shrieking against the windows, but inside, a fragile, stubborn warmth began to grow. Daniel, not knowing what else to do, kept talking to the dog as he worked, telling him about the broken pipes he'd fixed that afternoon, the cracked beams he'd finally braced, the annoying way the roof leaked right above the bed when the snow melted. It didn't matter what he said. The important thing was that he kept speaking, breathing life back into the hollow spaces of the room, the house, and perhaps himself. Time bled away. Eventually, the trembling of the dog's body slowed. His breathing became deeper, steadier. Daniel wrapped him in 2 dry towels, tucking him closer to the fire, and sat back against the armchair, exhausted but alert. The dog was still dangerously weak, but he had a chance now, a slim, stubborn chance. Daniel's gaze drifted over the small living room, patched and battered like its owner. The battered oak table gleamed faintly where he had sanded it. The faded photograph of Maria and Emily still perched on the mantel, watching with patient smiles. Selling the house had seemed like the right thing, the only thing to do. But now, watching the faint rise and fall of the dog's chest, Daniel wasn't so sure. Maybe life wasn't finished with him yet. Maybe the storm hadn't come to bury him, but to dig something out. The old clock on the wall ticked steadily, marking the minutes as snow piled higher outside the windows, sealing them inside a cocoon of ice and firelight. Daniel leaned back, the fire's warmth finally reaching the frozen corners of his spirit. The golden retriever, sensing perhaps the shift, gave a tiny, weary wag of his tail without opening his eyes. Daniel let out a breath that was almost a laugh, almost a sob, and whispered, "Good boy, Buddy. You're safe now." He didn't know yet that Buddy wasn't alone. That destiny, still swirling like snow beyond the walls, was already laying the next card on the table. For now, there was only the fire, the battered house, a man, and a dog, and for the first time in years that was enough. The night dragged on as the storm clawed at the old house, groaning against the wooden beams like some ancient beast. Inside, Daniel Brooks stayed vigil beside the frail golden retriever stretched out near the hearth. Buddy, as he had named him in the flickering hours between snow gusts, remained wrapped in Daniel's thick wool jacket and 2 worn towels, his shallow breaths barely disturbing the heavy air. Daniel, cradling a mug of lukewarm coffee more for the comfort of its warmth than for the taste, kept his gaze fixed on the dog, feeling something stirring deep inside him, something he thought had long since frozen solid. Every few minutes he reached out, gently rubbing Buddy's paws, massaging warmth back into the delicate pads, whispering encouragements as if words alone could tether the dog to life. Daniel's hands were large and rough, calloused from decades of woodworking, yet now they moved with a tenderness that startled even him. The fire sputtered but held strong, and the room, battered as it was by years of loneliness and neglect, seemed to lean in toward them, sheltering the fragile thread of hope being spun across the worn rug. At some point, Buddy's ear twitched, a minute but undeniable sign of life that caused Daniel to exhale a shaky breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Outside, the storm had intensified. Snow piled up against the door, burying the porch steps, and the swirling white obscured the few distant lights of Maple Ridge. Daniel thought of the road that wound down the mountain, now impassable, no way out even if he had wanted one. The world had shrunk to the size of a cabin, a fire, a man, and a dog. The thought didn't scare him the way he expected. Instead, it rooted him, as if for the first time in years, he had been given a purpose other than simply surviving the day. The old grandfather clock ticked its steady rhythm in the corner, marking the hours of the night's siege. Daniel carefully poured a bowl of lukewarm water, setting it down near Buddy's nose. The dog sniffed weakly but didn't move. Undeterred, Daniel dipped a finger into the water and brushed it lightly against Buddy's muzzle. A pink tongue flickered out, barely grazing the moisture, but it was enough. Another tiny step forward. Just as Daniel was about to settle back against the chair, the tablet resting on the nearby workbench pinged, the sudden noise slicing through the quiet room like a blade. Frowning, Daniel stood, joints protesting, and crossed to the table. His tablet was old, the screen scratched and the casing dented, but it still worked for basic things like checking email when the patchy satellite signal allowed. He tapped it awake, and the message flashed across the screen. It was from Samantha Reed, a real estate agent he had been reluctantly working with. Samantha was in her late 30s, petite and sharp-featured, with short-cropped chestnut hair and an efficient air that gave the impression she lived on caffeine and to-do lists. She had grown up in Maple Ridge, but had escaped to Burlington before being pulled back by family obligations. Life had taught her to be practical, almost to the point of bluntness, and she didn't have much patience for sentimentality, a trait that had often put her at odds with Daniel's slow, stubborn ways. The subject line of her email read, "Urgent, house sale before winter damages it further." Daniel sighed, already knowing the tone of the message without reading it. He clicked it open. "Daniel, the buyer is still interested, but only if we can finalize the deal before the end of the month. The inspector warned that another heavy storm could cause serious structural damage, and they don't want the liability. Please consider accepting the offer ASAP before the next snowfall buries that house for good." Samantha. Daniel leaned against the table, rubbing a hand over his unshaven face. Sell the house, leave Maple Ridge, start over. That had been the plan. But standing there, with Buddy struggling for life by the fire, the thought of abandoning the cabin, abandoning this strange, fragile new chapter before it had even properly begun, made his chest ache. He set the tablet down heavily and returned to Buddy's side. The dog's breathing was still shallow but steady, his golden fur slowly losing its iciness under the heat of the fire and the blankets. Daniel tucked another log into the flames, watching as the sparks leapt up eagerly, casting flickering shadows across the walls. "You're a stubborn one," Daniel muttered to Buddy, a half-smile tugging at his lips. "Good. You'll need it out here." He thought about Samantha, how she would roll her eyes if she knew he was hesitating over a dog, how she would lecture him about market values and repair costs and practicality. But there was nothing practical about Hope, Daniel mused, and perhaps that was precisely why it mattered. Hours trickled by. Outside, the storm gradually began to wane, the howling wind softening into sullen gusts, the heavy fall of snow becoming a gentle drift. In the pre-dawn dimness, the outlines of trees emerged beyond the windows, their branches heavy with white. Daniel dozed in the armchair, his head lolling back, but every creak or sigh from Buddy pulled him instantly awake. Sometime near morning, Buddy shifted slightly, letting out a small, pained grunt. His eyes blinked open, glassy and confused, and he struggled to lift his head. Daniel was at his side in an instant, steadying him with both hands. "Easy, boy," he said softly. "You're safe. You're home." The words surprised him even as they left his mouth. Home. It had been so long since he had said it and meant it. Buddy's gaze found his, and for a moment, something ancient and deep passed between them, something that needed no words. Daniel gently pressed the bowl of water closer, and this time, Buddy lapped at it with slow, shaky flicks of his tongue. A wave of fierce, ridiculous pride swelled in Daniel's chest. "You're a fighter," he whispered. The room around them felt different now, not merely a shelter from the storm, but something warmer, more alive. Outside, the first faint blush of dawn touched the horizon, the sky softening from iron gray to a bruised, tender blue. Daniel leaned back, exhausted but strangely light, like a man who had been carrying a great weight for years and had only now realized he could set it down. The tablet with Samantha's email sat untouched on the table. The decision could wait. For now, there was Buddy. For now, there was life. The first light of morning crept shyly across the frozen world outside, painting the heavy snowbanks in pale blues and muted grays. Inside Daniel's cabin, the fire had burned down to a glowing bed of embers, and the room smelled of wet fur, wood smoke, and faint traces of old varnish. Daniel Brooks sat curled in the armchair, his body aching from a night spent half sleeping, half guarding Buddy, the rescued golden retriever who now dozed peacefully, wrapped in blankets beside the fire. The storm had broken sometime near dawn, leaving behind an eerie stillness, the kind that filled the ears almost louder than noise. Daniel allowed himself a moment of peace, breathing in the quiet, believing for the first time in days that perhaps he and Buddy might both survive the winter after all. Then came the sound, a soft, hesitant scratching at the door. Daniel froze, every muscle in his body tensing. His mind raced through possibilities. A wild animal, a branch knocked loose, or worse, a trick of his exhausted mind. But then the scratching came again, followed by a whimper so thin and desperate it cut straight through him. Setting down his cold coffee, Daniel rose stiffly and crossed to the door. He hesitated only a second before pulling it open. The cold hit him first, a slap of air so sharp it made his eyes water. Blinking into the gray morning, he looked down and saw a tiny figure huddled against the porch post. A golden retriever puppy, no more than 5 months old, trembling violently, its pale fur clotted with ice and dirt. The pup was heartbreakingly small, its ribs protruding beneath the matted coat, one ear flopping down while the other struggled to stay upright. Daniel's breath caught. Without thinking, he dropped to one knee, murmuring soft, meaningless reassurances. The puppy tried to wag its tail but only managed a weak twitch before collapsing sideways into the snow. Gently, Daniel scooped the little body into his arms. The pup weighed almost nothing, and its tiny heart thudded rapidly against his chest like a frantic bird trapped in a cage. He hurried back inside, kicking the door closed behind him, and rushed to the fireside. Buddy stirred at the disturbance, lifting his head and sniffing the air. His cloudy brown eyes locked onto the bundle in Daniel's arms, and, astonishingly, his tail gave a slow, deliberate wag. Daniel laid the puppy down next to Buddy, carefully bundling him in a fresh towel. The older dog stretched his nose forward, giving the pup a gentle sniff, then rested his chin across the smaller body in a protective gesture so instinctive that it made Daniel's throat tighten painfully. He filled another bowl with lukewarm water and set it near the puppy's muzzle. The tiny dog didn't move at first, so Daniel dipped his fingers and brushed water against its dry lips. After a moment, the pink tongue flickered out, and a few weak licks followed. "You're going to be all right, little guy," Daniel said, his voice rough. "You found the right place." As he worked, Daniel found himself absently thinking of names. It had to be something strong, yet small enough for such a fragile creature. After a few minutes, he said aloud, "Max, that feels right. You're Max now." Max made a tiny noise of agreement, or perhaps just a sleepy whimper, and snuggled closer against Buddy's side. The older dog gave another slow wag, shifting slightly to make more room for his new charge. Daniel sat back on his heels, studying them both. They didn't just look like strays. They looked like survivors of something much crueler than a winter storm. His gut twisted at the thought. The fire crackled softly. Outside, a thick silence had settled over Maple Ridge, broken only by the occasional groan of snow sliding off the roof. Daniel rose stiffly and crossed to the corner where an old cedar chest sat, half hidden beneath a faded quilt. He hadn't opened it in years. Dust coated the lid, and the hinges creaked in protest when he lifted it. Inside were the remnants of another life. Photo albums, birthday cards, Emily's first crayon drawings, a pressed flower bouquet from Maria's wedding day. Daniel's hands trembled as he sorted through the memories, every object a shard of something both precious and unbearable. At the bottom of the chest, tucked into a leather-bound journal, he found the letter, the one he had written to Emily after the accident but had never sent anywhere, had never even had the courage to read again. The envelope was yellowed with age, the ink slightly smudged. Daniel sat down heavily at the kitchen table, the letter clutched in his calloused hands. He didn't open it. He couldn't. Instead, he pressed it to his forehead and closed his eyes, breathing deeply. The grief was different now, not the sharp, tearing agony it had been in the beginning, but a heavy ache, dull and persistent like an old wound that ached with the coming of rain. From the hearth, a soft whimper drew his attention back. Buddy had shifted slightly, and Max had wriggled himself deeper under Buddy's chin. The sight pierced Daniel's heart. Family, even broken, battered, unexpected family, had a way of stitching itself back together in the most unlikely forms. He stood, pushing the letter back into the chest without opening it, and returned to the fireside. Settling onto the rug, he stroked Buddy's ears and Max's tiny back in turn, marveling at the miracle of their survival. "You're not alone anymore," he murmured. "None of us are." Outside, the day brightened slowly, the snow reflecting the first pale beams of sun. Inside, the warmth grew, faint but determined, stubborn as life itself. The morning sun hung low and pale in the sky, offering little warmth against the bitter cold that gripped Maple Ridge. The town, usually bustling with the quiet rhythm of daily life even in winter, now lay muted under a heavy quilt of snow. Daniel Brooks stood by the window, his breath fogging the glass as he watched the stillness outside. Inside, Buddy and Max slept curled together by the fire, their steady breathing the only sound that anchored the cabin to life. Daniel's coffee had gone cold in his hands, but he hardly noticed. His mind kept returning to the question that had needled him since dawn. Where had the dogs come from? Pulling on his thickest coat, a battered canvas parka patched at the elbows, and an old wool scarf, Daniel laced up his heavy boots and grabbed the flashlight from the hook by the door. The snow had drifted high against the porch, and it took effort to force the door open, letting in a blast of frigid air. Shivering despite himself, Daniel stepped out into the dazzling, blinding white. The world outside was muffled, the snow absorbing all sound except the crunch of his boots as he moved cautiously forward. He circled the porch first, scanning the fresh layer of snow. It didn't take long to find them, tracks shallow but distinct. 2 sets of paw prints, one large and one small, leading from the dense line of trees at the edge of the property directly to his door. But what made his stomach tighten was the 3rd set. Human footprints, heavier, dragging slightly as if the person had been limping or carrying something. Daniel crouched low, studying the tracks. They hadn't been made that long ago. The edges were still crisp, untouched by wind or further snowfall. A prickle of unease crept up his spine. Why would someone be out in a storm like that, leading 2 dogs toward an isolated cabin? And why leave them behind? The thought gnawed at him as he followed the prints toward the tree line. The air was sharp in his lungs, the sky overhead a brittle, washed-out blue. Every few steps he stopped and scanned the forest, half expecting to see movement among the trees. But the woods stood silent, branches heavy with snow, casting long skeletal shadows over the ground. Before he could venture further, the sharp ring of his cell phone startled him. Daniel fumbled it out of his coat pocket, squinting at the screen. The name Claire Brooks blinked up at him, a name he hadn't seen displayed on his phone in over a year. Claire was Daniel's older sister by 4 years, tall and thin, with a striking presence that somehow blended sharp intelligence and unyielding warmth. Her thick auburn hair, always pulled back into a no-nonsense bun, was beginning to show streaks of silver, but she wore them with a stubborn pride. Claire had spent her life as a nurse in Boston, the kind of woman who thrived on order and routine. She had never understood Daniel's retreat into isolation after losing his family, and their relationship had frayed badly, stretched thin by grief and unspoken blame. Daniel hesitated before answering. "Hello," he said, his voice rough from disuse. There was a pause, then Claire's familiar voice, brisk but laced with something softer he hadn't heard in years. "Danny, I heard about the storm. Are you all right?" "I'm fine," he said automatically, his eyes still scanning the woods. "You should leave, Danny," she said without preamble. "Sell the house and get out before the next storm hits. That place, it's a coffin. It's not a home anymore." Daniel swallowed hard, watching the way the trees trembled under a sudden gust of wind. "I can't just leave." "You can," Claire insisted, her tone gentle but firm. "You just don't want to. But you have to think about yourself now. About living, not just surviving." There was a long silence between them, filled only by the low hiss of static on the line and the soft sighing of the forest. Finally, Daniel said, "It's not that simple." "It never is," Claire said, and in those 4 words there was more forgiveness and understanding than he had dared hope for. "But maybe it's time to try." He wanted to argue, to explain about Buddy and Max, about how something had shifted inside him when he had pulled those broken animals into his home, but he couldn't find the words to make it make sense. Instead, he said, "I'll think about it." Claire exhaled, a faint, almost relieved sound. "That's all I ask." They hung up without any formal goodbyes, Brooke's family tradition, but the call lingered with Daniel as he pocketed the phone and returned his attention to the tracks. They led deeper into the woods, swallowed eventually by the heavy drifts where the snow had fallen harder. Daniel didn't follow them any further. Something inside him, something ancient and cautious, warned him against venturing too far today. Instead, he turned back toward the cabin, heart heavy with the knowledge that whatever had brought those dogs to his door wasn't random. As he approached the house, he caught sight of Buddy's head lifting through the window, the old dog's eyes sharp despite his exhaustion. Max, curled in a tight golden ball, slept soundly against Buddy's side. The sight steadied Daniel in a way nothing else could have. No matter what waited in the woods, no matter who had led those tracks to his home, he knew this much for certain. He wasn't walking away this time. Inside, the fire had burned low again. Daniel added more wood, stirring the embers back to life. He sank down onto the floor beside the dogs, one hand resting lightly on Buddy's side, the other on Max's small, trembling back. Outside, the sun continued to climb, bright and cold over a world blanketed in silence. Inside, surrounded by fragile breaths and stubborn heartbeats, Daniel finally understood something he had been running from for years. Family found you in strange ways. Sometimes it clawed at your door in the middle of a snowstorm. Sometimes it wagged a weary tail. And sometimes it whispered through a crackling phone line from miles away. You're not as alone as you think. The next morning dawned cold and brittle, the sun barely a pale smear against a sky the color of steel. Daniel Brooks pulled on his thick parka, the heavy canvas groaning under the strain of stiff, frozen seams, and laced his boots with numb fingers. Inside the cabin, Buddy sat alert by the door, his ears perked, his tail tapping the floor in slow, deliberate beats. Max, smaller and still recovering, snoozed curled in a tight ball by the fireplace, a soft snore occasionally slipping from his pink nose. Daniel hesitated, glancing once more at Max's fragile form before nodding at Buddy. "Let's go, boy," he murmured. "Show me." Buddy moved with a surprising steadiness for a dog who had nearly frozen to death days earlier. His golden coat, still dulled from malnutrition and exposure, ruffled slightly in the sharp breeze that met them outside. His eyes, cloudy but intent, scanned the tree line before he took off at a determined, loping pace through the deep snow. Daniel followed, his boots crunching with every heavy step, the breath from his lungs forming thick clouds in the morning air. They moved beyond the clearing where Daniel had seen the strange tracks, plunging into the denser part of the forest where the trees knitted together in tangled branches overhead, filtering the cold light into broken shadows. Buddy moved with purpose, his nose low to the ground, occasionally glancing back to make sure Daniel was keeping up. The deeper they went, the quieter it became. Even the wind seemed reluctant to stir here. Daniel felt the old, instinctive tension coil in his shoulders, the kind he used to feel when walking unfamiliar job sites before Maria's accident, always wary of hidden dangers. Buddy led them down a faint trail, more suggested by broken branches and disturbed snow than any clear path, until they reached a small clearing. At first, Daniel almost missed it. Tucked into a hollow against the base of a rocky outcrop was a ramshackle structure, half swallowed by snow and creeping vines. It might once have been a hunting shack, but now it sagged heavily under the weight of years and neglect. The wooden slats were splintered and gray with rot, the single window cracked and grimy. Buddy stopped a few feet away, his body rigid, his tail still, his eyes locked onto the doorway hanging ajar on rusted hinges. Daniel approached cautiously, the hairs on the back of his neck prickling. Pushing the door open with the toe of his boot, he peered inside. The smell hit him first, a sour, metallic stench of damp wood, old urine, and fear. The shack was empty of people, but not of evidence. Against the far wall were several metal cages, the bars bent and rusted, scraps of filthy blankets and broken bowls scattered across the floor. Scratches marred the wooden walls, deep and frantic. His stomach twisted. This hadn't been shelter. This had been a prison. He moved slowly into the shack, scanning every corner, every crevice. On a battered makeshift table by the back wall, half buried under a stained tarp, he found it. A notebook, the leather cover cracked and stiff with cold. Daniel hesitated only a moment before picking it up. He brushed snow and grime from the surface and flipped it open. Inside, rows of cramped, spidery handwriting detailed dates, descriptions, and prices. There were numbers and notations, brief remarks about size, obedience, potential resale value. Some entries had stars next to them, notes about good temperament, or ideal for breeding. Others were crossed out roughly, replaced with the words unsuitable or discarded. Daniel's hands trembled as he turned the pages. Buddy stood quietly behind him as if sensing the gravity of the moment. Flipping towards the back of the book, Daniel found a name listed. Subject #27, adult male golden retriever, high endurance, excellent compliance, projected high resale value. Buddy, he was sure of it. Daniel closed the book with a snap, his heart hammering against his ribs. Whoever had run this place had been treating dogs like merchandise, like tools to be bought, sold, and discarded when no longer profitable. And they had been close. Too close. How many others hadn't made it out of these cages? He stepped outside, blinking against the stark, blinding whiteness of the snow. The cold gnawed at his cheeks, but he hardly felt it. Buddy brushed against his leg, grounding him, reminding him that not all had been lost. They trudged back toward the cabin in silence, the notebook tucked securely inside Daniel's coat. As the cabin came into view, smoke curling lazily from the chimney, Daniel felt an ache of gratitude so sharp it nearly doubled him over. He had been given a second chance, no, 2 second chances, in the form of Buddy and Max. Inside the cabin, Max perked his head up at their return, his tail thumping weakly against the floor. Daniel set the notebook carefully on the table and knelt by the fireplace, gathering both dogs close, feeling the fragile, precious warmth of their bodies against him. The fire crackled, casting a golden glow across the worn floorboards. Daniel stared into the flames, lost in memory. He thought of Maria, her voice laughing, alive, as she spun plans for a future they had never reached. A small rescue shelter she had dreamed aloud once, a place for lost and broken animals to find their way home again. Daniel had smiled at the time, indulging her fantasy without really believing in it. But now, with Buddy's steady breathing in one ear and Max's small heartbeat against his side, the dream didn't seem so far-fetched. Maybe it was time to pick up the pieces Maria had left behind. Maybe saving these two souls was just the beginning. For the first time in years, the cabin didn't feel like a tomb. It felt like a beginning. The sky was beginning to bruise toward twilight, a dull wash of purple and steel hanging over Maple Ridge. The temperature had plunged again. The snow crusted hard under Daniel's boots as he moved about the small clearing outside his cabin, gathering kindling to stoke the fire for the long night ahead. Buddy watched him from the porch, sitting upright but relaxed, the faintest twitch of his ear betraying his watchfulness. Max dozed in a soft pile of blankets just inside the open doorway, one paw twitching now and then in some puppy dream. The world was still, unnervingly so, the kind of silence that settled heavily over the woods before something shifted. Daniel was bent over, scooping dry twigs into his arms, when the hair at the back of his neck stood up. He straightened slowly, heart hammering in sudden alarm. Someone was there, watching. He scanned the trees, the snowfields, but at first there was nothing. Then, movement. A dark figure emerging from the edge of the woods, walking with heavy, deliberate steps. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, wrapped in a black canvas coat that hung stiffly over bulky layers. His face was mostly hidden by a hood and a scarf pulled high against the cold, but what little Daniel could see was rough, weathered skin and sharp eyes that glinted with something mean. His boots crunched through the snow, and he carried himself with the casual menace of someone used to getting his way without asking nicely. Daniel's gut twisted in instinctive warning. Whoever this man was, he hadn't stumbled here by accident. "You got something that belongs to me?" the man called out, his voice rough and low, slicing the cold air between them. He stopped a few yards away, shoulders squared, arms loose at his sides. Daniel shifted his stance subtly, putting himself between the cabin and Max inside and the stranger. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said evenly, though his heart slammed against his ribs. The man took another step forward, the scarf slipping slightly to reveal a jaw clenched tight with anger. "The book. You found it. Give it here, and nobody has to get hurt." Behind Daniel, Buddy growled, a deep, warning rumble that seemed to vibrate through the frozen ground. The golden retriever moved down the steps of the porch with slow, measured steps, placing himself solidly at Daniel's side. Despite his recent weakness, Buddy's stance was steady, his body tense, his gaze locked onto the stranger with unwavering focus. The man hesitated, flicking his gaze to Buddy, then back to Daniel. "You don't know what you're messing with, old man," he said, though there was less certainty in his tone now. Daniel stood his ground. Something inside him had shifted over the last few days, solidified into something new and unbreakable. He wasn't the man who had hidden from the world anymore. He wasn't the man who let fear speak louder than conviction. Not anymore. "You're the one who doesn't understand," Daniel said, voice steady. "These dogs aren't your property. They never were." The man's mouth twisted into a sneer. "That's not how the world works." Buddy growled again, low and dangerous. The man flinched visibly, taking a half step back. For a moment, the tension snapped taut between them, a hair away from violence. Daniel felt it in every line of his body, in Buddy's vibrating frame. Then the man cursed under his breath, spun on his heel, and disappeared into the trees as quickly as he had come, his heavy boots throwing up powdery sprays of snow with every retreating step. Daniel didn't chase him. Buddy barked once, sharp and triumphant, then sat back on his haunches, his chest heaving but proud. Daniel knelt beside him, resting a firm hand on the dog's broad shoulders. "You did good, Buddy," he said softly. "You did real good." He stayed there for a long moment, letting the adrenaline bleed out of his system, feeling the solid reality of Buddy's strength anchoring him. Inside the cabin, Max let out a soft bark, sensing the danger had passed but still needing reassurance. Daniel rose and went back inside, bolting the door securely behind him. He set another log on the fire, the flames crackling eagerly to life. Buddy flopped down heavily by the hearth, his body tired but his spirit unbowed. Max scrambled over to press against Buddy's side, seeking comfort. Daniel sat heavily in the worn armchair, the notebook still safely hidden away, untouched. He stared into the fire, the flickering light carving deep lines across his face, and realized something profound had shifted inside him tonight. For the first time in years, he had faced down fear, not by hiding, not by backing away, but by standing tall, by protecting those who needed him. Maria had once told him that real courage wasn't about being fearless. It was about doing the right thing even when every bone in your body told you to run. Tonight, Daniel understood those words in his blood and bones. Outside, the wind began to pick up again, whistling softly through the trees. But inside, surrounded by two souls who had trusted him with their lives, Daniel felt an unfamiliar but welcome warmth settle deep within his chest. He wasn't running anymore. The morning after the confrontation was clear and bitterly cold, the sky a vast sheet of pale glass stretching endlessly over Maple Ridge. Inside the cabin, the fire had burned low, but warmth lingered in the heavy air, clinging to the walls, to the sleeping forms of Buddy and Max curled together on the rug. Daniel Brooks sat at the battered kitchen table, the old notebook, the one that could bring down the men who had treated animals like cargo, lying open before him. His decision had been made the night before, carved into the bedrock of his heart during the silent hours while Buddy and Max slept peacefully at his feet. He wasn't going to run. Not from the danger, not from his fear, and not from the ghosts of the past. Bundling himself in his heavy coat, Daniel tucked the notebook securely into his satchel. He glanced once more at Buddy, who lifted his head slightly, his cloudy eyes sharp despite the lingering exhaustion. "Hold down the fort," Daniel said quietly, and with one last look at the cabin that had begun to feel like something close to hope, he stepped out into the snow. The Maple Ridge Sheriff's Office sat at the end of Main Street, a squat brick building that looked more like a forgotten library than a center of justice. The town's sheriff, Eddie Harmon, was a solid man in his early 50s, with a wide, honest face framed by thick salt and pepper hair, and a mustache that seemed permanently stained with coffee. Eddie had lived in Maple Ridge all his life, a man whose greatest battles had usually involved wrangling drunk hunters or settling property line disputes. He wore his uniform like a second skin, the kind that had molded itself to the body through decades of quiet, steady service. When Daniel pushed through the front door, the bell overhead jingled with a sound that felt almost absurdly cheerful given the weight in his chest. Eddie looked up from his cluttered desk, squinting at first before recognition dawned. "Daniel Brooks," Eddie said, pushing himself to his feet, the old leather chair creaking in protest. "Haven't seen you much in town lately." "Been busy," Daniel replied shortly, tapping the satchel. I've got something you need to see." Eddie's eyes narrowed slightly, sensing the seriousness under Daniel's worn voice. He gestured to a small conference table near the back of the room. "All right, let's have it." Daniel laid the notebook on the table, flipping it open to the first damning page. Eddie pulled his reading glasses from his breast pocket, perched them on his nose, and began to read. As he moved through the pages, his frown deepened, his hand tightening into a fist against the table's scarred surface. "Jesus," Eddie muttered, voice low and grim. "How'd you come across this?" Daniel told him everything, about finding Buddy and Max, about the shack in the woods, about the man who had come looking for the notebook, threatening violence. Eddie listened without interrupting, his face growing darker with every word. When Daniel finished, Eddie closed the notebook carefully, his hand lingering on the cracked leather cover. "You did the right thing bringing this in, Daniel. No doubt about it. This could blow the whole operation wide open. Been hearing whispers for months about illegal breeding outfits moving north, but never had anything to pin them with." "Will you go after them?" Daniel asked, his voice quieter now. Eddie nodded grimly. "You bet your life we will. I'll call the state troopers, maybe even the feds if we need to. We're going to tear this thing apart, root and branch." Relief, sharp and sudden, loosened something deep in Daniel's chest. He stood to leave, but Eddie stopped him with a firm hand on his shoulder. "And Daniel," the sheriff said, his tone softening, "those dogs, you gave them a second chance. Sometimes that's enough to turn the whole world around." Daniel only nodded, unable to find words big enough to answer. The drive back to the cabin was shorter somehow, the cold air no longer biting so sharply, the sunlight almost feeling warm against the snow. When he opened the door, Buddy and Max were waiting. Buddy's tail thumping the floor in a slow, heavy rhythm, Max bouncing awkwardly to his feet and tumbling forward in excitement. Daniel laughed, a sound rusty with disuse, and knelt to gather both dogs into his arms. "We did it," he murmured into Buddy's soft fur. "We're safe now." Later that afternoon, after feeding the dogs and stoking the fire high, Daniel pulled out the papers Samantha Reed had left with him months ago, the sale contract for the house. He stared at the lines of print for a long moment before tearing them cleanly in half. He wasn't leaving. Not now. Not ever. Instead, he found himself sketching plans on a legal pad, rough and hurried at first, but gaining confidence with every stroke of the pencil. New fencing around the property, renovating the barn into proper kennels, filing for nonprofit status, opening the doors to animals who had nowhere else to go. Maria's dream, once a fragile thing spoken into the space between heartbeat and breath, was being reborn in rough, bold lines across a battered kitchen table. By nightfall, the cabin buzzed with a different kind of energy, the kind that filled empty rooms with purpose. Buddy and Max slept curled together by the fire, their bodies touching, safe and warm. Daniel sat at the table, plans spread before him, the spark of a future burning brightly in his chest. Outside, the snow began to fall again, soft and quiet, a benediction rather than a threat. And inside, justice had found its first foothold. Spring had crept cautiously into Maple Ridge, melting the hard crust of winter inch by reluctant inch. The snowbanks shrank back from the roadsides, the pines shrugged off their heavy white coats, and the sun returned, timid but persistent, to the wide skies overhead. At the edge of town, the old Brooks cabin, once a place of silence and broken dreams, now pulsed with new life. Inside, Buddy and Max were a blur of movement and noise. Buddy, now fully restored to health, carried himself with a quiet dignity, his golden coat thick and glossy once again, his eyes still a bit cloudy but filled with warmth and watchfulness. Max, now nearly a year old, was pure energy, a whirlwind of floppy paws, bright eyes, and endless curiosity. His coat had deepened into a rich, buttery gold, and his tail seemed never to stop wagging, a living metronome of joy. Daniel Brooks stood in the center of the chaos, his hands on his hips, a slow, disbelieving smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. It had taken months of hard work, countless late nights repairing the barn and fencing the yard, meetings with city clerks and veterinarians to secure the right licenses, and long talks with Sheriff Eddie Harmon, who had become an unexpected ally, ensuring the legal aftermath of the illegal kennel operation didn't tangle Daniel's plans. But finally, after all the struggle, the first rescued animals had arrived last week. Today, 2 more were due to join them. Daniel had built out 4 large kennels in the refurbished barn and had already filled 2. A sweet-natured beagle named Daisy, whose ears were too big for her tiny head, and whose tendency to trip over them had become the highlight of Daniel's evenings, and a shy, skinny tabby cat named Oliver, who had lost his tail to frostbite but made up for it with a rumbling purr so loud it seemed to shake the walls. Both animals had come from broken places, just like Buddy, just like Max, just like Daniel himself, and here they were finding a home. Not a temporary stop, not a halfway place, but a true home. A battered blue pickup truck crunched down the driveway, kicking up muddy slush. Daniel stepped onto the porch, shielding his eyes against the low afternoon sun. Behind the wheel was Rachel Monroe, a volunteer from the regional shelter. Rachel was in her early 30s, medium height, with an easy smile and auburn hair she wore in a loose braid down her back. She had a way of making everyone, animals and humans alike, feel at ease. A warmth that Daniel had found both comforting and a little bewildering after so many years of isolation. Rachel hopped down from the truck, her boots squelching in the soft mud. "Afternoon, Daniel," she called brightly, rounding the truck to open the rear gate. "I've got 2 special ones for you today." Daniel approached as Rachel carefully lifted out a medium-sized dog, an older shepherd mix with a graying muzzle and soulful brown eyes. The dog wagged his tail once, tentatively, and leaned into Rachel's side for comfort. "This is Murphy," Rachel said, scratching behind the dog's ear. 10 years old, sweet as sugar, but a little scared of men at first. Had a rough go. Daniel crouched low, extending his hand slowly, letting Murphy sniff him. After a moment, Murphy stepped forward and nuzzled his fingers. Daniel felt something break loose in his chest, something good. "And inside the crate," Rachel added, opening the carrier door, "is Peanut. She's tiny but mighty." A tiny chihuahua, barely more than a handful, peered out with enormous dark eyes, her body trembling like a leaf. She wore a purple knit sweater 2 sizes too big, and when Daniel scooped her gently into his hands, she gave a nervous little yap before licking his thumb. Rachel chuckled. "She bosses everyone around at the shelter. Figured Buddy and Max could use someone to keep them humble." Daniel laughed, a deep, genuine sound that warmed the air around them. They settled Murphy and Peanut into their new kennels, letting them acclimate. Buddy and Max watched with curious interest, tails wagging, and Daisy barked excitedly from her pen. Even Oliver sauntered over from his favorite sunspot to investigate, his bright green eyes wide with curiosity. Rachel leaned against the fence, her arms crossed loosely. "You know," she said, "what you're doing here, it matters." Daniel didn't answer right away. He watched Max nudge Buddy toward Murphy, saw the tentative sniffing, the slow wagging of tails, the cautious, hopeful beginnings of friendship. His throat tightened with emotion he didn't dare name. "I think it matters to me, too," he said finally, his voice rough. Rachel smiled that easy, open smile and clapped him gently on the shoulder. "You're not alone anymore, Daniel." As dusk began to fall, casting the fields in long golden shadows, Daniel stood on the front porch, Buddy and Max flanking him on either side. The two dogs leaned into his legs, warm and solid and real. Together, they watched the snow begin to fall again, not the fierce, biting snow of winter's rage, but soft, lazy flakes that drifted down like blessings from a wide, forgiving sky. Daniel felt it then, deep and true. The long, aching loneliness that had wrapped itself around him for years was gone, melted away like the last stubborn patches of winter. In its place was something stronger. Family. Purpose. A beginning, not an ending. He reached down, scratching behind Buddy's ears, ruffling Max's golden fur. "We're home," he said simply. And this time it was the truth. Sometimes miracles do not come crashing into our lives with thunder and lightning. Sometimes they arrive quietly, on four trembling paws in the form of a broken soul that teaches us how to heal. Buddy and Max were not just two lost dogs. They were a reminder from God that even in our darkest winters, love finds a way to reach us. In everyday life, we are surrounded by small miracles. A second chance, a kind word, a hand reaching out when we least expect it. We only need to open our hearts and see them for what they are. Gifts, not accidents. This story reminds us that no matter how lost, broken, or abandoned we feel, God is always planting seeds of hope around us, waiting for us to nurture them with love. If this story touched your heart, please share it with your friends. Leave a comment to let us know your thoughts, and do not forget to subscribe to the channel for more inspiring stories. May God bless everyone who listens to this story. If you believe that love and second chances are truly miracles from above, comment Amen below and let us spread hope together.